Europe is facing one of its most dangerous moments in years. China has just sanctioned 2 European banks. At first glance, it seems minor, but it's a warning. Beijing is showing it can target far larger institutions if it chooses. And the clash began with Europe itself, when the EU sanctioned Chinese banks for doing business with Russia. At the same time, Washington is piling on the pressure. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is pushing the EU to punish BRICS nations, not to help Europe, but to defend the dollar. That's a costly demand, since Europe trades with BRICS in the hundreds of billions. Italy shows how deep this pressure runs. Take Pirelli. A Chinese state firm owns a large stake, which should mean access to China's car market. Instead, Trump's team blocked Pirelli from selling tires to Formula One in the U.S. under national security. If tires are treated as a threat, no industry is safe. And now Trump is preparing a 300% tariff on chips, the backbone of cars, planes, smartphones, AI, and defense systems. Such a move could send prices soaring, snap supply chains, and drag Europe into chaos alongside the US. In this video, we'll break it all down. Subscribe now so you don't miss the full picture. And it all starts with Trump's warning, a threat aimed directly at BRICS that set the stage for Europe's latest miscalculation. Just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump stood in front of the cameras and issued a threat that rattled governments around the world. He warned BRICS that if they tried to build alternatives to the US dollar, he would hit them with tariffs. Not selective tariffs, but at least 10% on everything across the board. It was a blunt message. The dollar must remain at the center of global trade, or America will make you pay for challenging it. This is where Europe entered the picture. Instead of pausing to weigh its own interests, Brussels rushed to show it was aligned with Washington. In early August, the EU rolled out its latest sanctions package, the 18th since the war in Ukraine began. Buried inside that package was a move that raised eyebrows: sanctions on 2 small Chinese banks. The banks, Suifenhe Rural Commercial Bank and Heihe Rural Commercial Bank, are obscure lenders in northeast China. Unless you live along the Chinese-Russian border, you've likely never heard of them. Their business is mostly local: cross-border trade, regional financing, and even some crypto-related transactions. The EU argued they were helping Russia sidestep sanctions and announced that, as of August 9th, European companies were banned from working with them. But here's the catch. These banks don't operate in Europe. They don't fund European businesses, they don't handle European transactions, and they have no presence in the EU's financial system. In other words, Brussels gained nothing tangible from this decision. What they did accomplish, however, was provoking Beijing. And this happened despite clear warnings. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi told EU diplomats repeatedly, "If you sanction our banks, there will be consequences." Those warnings were ignored, and the result was predictable. China wasted no time in preparing its response. On August 13th, Beijing announced sanctions against 2 Lithuanian banks, UAB Urbo Bankas and AB Mano Bankas. These aren't major institutions either. They're small players inside Lithuania. But that's not the point. What matters is why Beijing chose them. Lithuania and China have been locked in a bitter dispute since 2021, when Vilnius allowed Taiwan to open a Taiwanese representative office. That move triggered a sharp backlash. China downgraded diplomatic ties, expelled Lithuanian diplomats, and blocked Lithuanian exports from entering its market. So, when the EU went after Chinese banks, Beijing knew exactly where to respond: by hitting Lithuania. The sanctions banned Chinese companies and individuals from doing business with those 2 banks. The choice was deliberate. It wasn't about the size of the institutions, but about making a statement. Beijing wanted to show Europe that escalation would not be ignored, and it delivered that response within days. And this is where the real problem begins. Because when you weigh the balance of power, it's Europe, not China, that stands to suffer most from this standoff. Here's the reality. Europe has far more at stake in this confrontation than China. In 2024, EU-China trade reached nearly 800 billion euros. China is one of Europe's most important markets for cars, luxury goods, and industrial equipment. German automakers like Volkswagen and BMW sell more vehicles in China than at home. French companies such as LVMH depend on Chinese consumers for fashion, champagne, and luxury goods. Italy's machine builders and Spain's agricultural producers also rely heavily on Chinese demand. The dependence runs the other way, too. Europe imports critical goods from China: solar panels, EV batteries, rare earth metals, and pharmaceuticals. Without these, the EU's green transition, its push for renewable energy and electric mobility, would grind to a halt. So why risk all this to sanction two rural banks that don't even operate in Europe? The answer lies in Washington. Brussels is following Trump's lead, even though his policies often target Europe directly. Just weeks ago, he threatened tariffs on European cars and steel, accusing the EU of exploiting America on trade. Yet Brussels continues to fall in line. This leaves Europe in a lose-lose position, pressuring China to please Trump while Trump prepares measures against Europe. And his tariff threats don't stop with China and Russia. They extend to the entire BRICS bloc, now more than 20 nations, including Brazil, India, and South Africa, countries Europe desperately needs as alternative trading partners. Meanwhile, Russia, the original target, is far from crippled. Moscow has built parallel payment systems, is trading oil and gas with India and China in local currencies, and is experimenting with the digital yuan. Cutting off two small border banks does nothing to change that. In the end, the sanctions are pure symbolism. Brussels wanted to show unity with Washington and look tough on Moscow. Instead, it provoked China, a partner Europe cannot afford to lose, and gained nothing in return. The warnings were there from the start. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi made it clear to European diplomats, "If you do this, we will retaliate." Behind closed doors, Chinese officials were telling European companies the same thing: don't get dragged into Washington's battles. But Brussels pressed ahead anyway, convinced that Beijing wouldn't react, or that any response would be limited. That assumption has already fallen apart. China is not isolated. It is the world's second-largest economy and holds enormous influence over the very industries Europe depends on. The sanctions on two Lithuanian banks were just a reminder of what Beijing can do if it chooses. Its options stretch far beyond small lenders. China could restrict access to its car market, choke off demand for European luxury goods, or tighten the flow of critical raw materials like rare earths. Any one of those moves would hit Europe's economy hard. Combined, they could trigger a shock that Europe is unprepared to absorb. And this is the deeper risk. Europe isn't just facing a banking spat. It's stepping into a confrontation where Beijing has far greater leverage and Washington is pushing from the other side. The stage is being set for a much larger global struggle, one where the EU has the weakest hand at the table. To understand what's really happening, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. Washington is fighting to preserve its grip on the global financial system. The dollar still dominates as the world's reserve currency, but BRICS nations are moving quickly to build alternatives. That is what set Trump off. His tariff threats weren't just about trade. They were about protecting the dollar's role at the center of everything. The problem for Washington is that every threat pushes BRICS closer together. The bloc is expanding, welcoming new members, and investing in payment systems designed to bypass the dollar entirely. The most recent BRICS summit placed cross-border settlements at the top of its agenda, and trade in local currencies is accelerating. Instead of slowing this process down, Trump's pressure campaign is speeding it up. And now Europe has inserted itself into this storm. Instead of striking a balance and protecting its own interests, Brussels has chosen to tie itself to Washington's agenda. That decision leaves the EU exposed, not only to China's retaliation, but also to the growing shift in global trade and finance away from the dollar. Europe could have positioned itself as a bridge between the two sides. Instead, it's fastening itself to a partner whose leverage is slipping, just as the rest of the world is learning to move on without the dollar. Italy is a clear example of how US pressure is shaping Europe's choices. On the surface, Rome appears to be scaling back trade with China. But this isn't a decision rooted in economics. It's rooted in fear of Washington's reaction. Chinese investment has been a lifeline for parts of Italy's economy. It has created jobs, opened doors to technology, and given Italian companies access to one of the fastest-growing consumer markets in the world. Yet instead of building on that, Italy is being pushed to roll it back. Take Pirelli, the country's flagship tire manufacturer. A Chinese state-owned firm, Sinochem, owns 37% of the company. That stake should translate into greater access to China's massive auto market and new opportunities for growth. But that's not what happened. Instead, the US intervened, blocking Pirelli from selling tires to Formula One in America on the grounds of national security. Tires, of all things, were labeled a risk. It may sound absurd, but it illustrates the reality. Washington is deciding which European companies are allowed to succeed and which ones must be held back. Italy, rather than charting its own course, is making decisions based on what it believes will keep US pressure at bay. And this isn't just about one company. It reflects a wider trend, where European nations shrink their own opportunities, not because it makes sense for their people, but because they fear the consequences of defying Washington. 19 rounds of sanctions later, Russia's economy is still standing. Instead of collapsing, it has adapted by redirecting trade and finding new partners. Non-oil revenues remain strong, backed by agricultural exports, fertilizers, and arms sales now flowing to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The partnership with China has only deepened. In 2024, Russian trade with Beijing reached record levels, giving Moscow the financial cushion to withstand Western pressure. Europe, by contrast, is straining under its own decisions. German exports to China have dropped sharply since 2022, especially in cars and precision machinery. Cutting itself off from Russian energy has forced European industries to absorb higher costs. Manufacturers now pay 2 to 3 times more for energy than their Asian competitors. The gap is eroding competitiveness, forcing factories to scale down, relocate production abroad, and cut jobs. The irony is striking. While Europe chokes its own industries, Russia is integrating more deeply into BRICS supply chains. The sanctions campaign has backfired, exposing how little leverage Brussels actually holds. The numbers are telling. Only about 15% of BRICS trade involves the EU, while Europe's reliance on BRICS goods is far greater. From Russian gas and Brazilian soybeans to South African minerals and Chinese electronics, Europe is tied to BRICS at every stage of production. If Brussels follows Washington's call for broader sanctions, the consequences will be immediate. Soaring input costs, worsening energy shortages, raw material imports drying up, and European exports priced out of world markets. The result could be an economic implosion that strikes faster than leaders in Berlin or Paris are willing to admit. And just as Europe weakens itself, Washington is preparing a move that could shake not only Europe but the entire global economy. The escalation of Trump's tariff war into the semiconductor sector. The most alarming twist in this story comes from Washington's next move. Trump is preparing to escalate directly into the semiconductor sector. According to leaks from inside the administration, tariffs of up to 300% on foreign-made chips are on the table. The aim is clear. Force giants like TSMC, Samsung, and Japanese suppliers such as Tokyo Electron to relocate their most critical supply chains onto US soil. But the consequences would be immense. If those companies give in, production costs in the United States will explode. American labor and infrastructure are far more expensive than in East Asia, and the higher costs will ripple across every industry. If they refuse, US consumers will bear the brunt, facing surging chip prices that would make everything, from smartphones and laptops to electric cars and advanced defense systems, far more expensive. At the same time, rare earth supplies already stretched thin would be pushed to breaking point. What Washington is pursuing isn't careful industrial planning. It's an attempt to seize control of the global semiconductor market through sheer force. But the gamble is enormous. Can the United States really strong-arm Asia's most advanced manufacturers without provoking retaliation that could cripple its own tech sector? And the fallout won't stop at America's borders. If Trump pushes ahead, the trade structure that underpins both the US and the EU could collapse. For Europe, already caught between China's retaliation and Washington's demands, this would mean being dragged into a storm it has no way of controlling. The real question is, Will Europe wake up and defend its own interests? Or will it continue to sacrifice them for Washington's battles? For more updates on these developments, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this unfolding crisis.